Good morning, everybody. This is Attorney Dylan Greenwood.
This is Attorney Harold Eustache.
Here at Greenwood Law, and this is For the Record with Greenwood Law, again this Sunday morning. Thank you for joining us out there. And holiday season is definitely upon us, and today we're going to be talking about different crimes and stuff that are larceny and theft related. We definitely see an uptick of these types of crimes around the holiday. You've been a prosecutor. You've seen that directly, haven't you?
Around the holidays, unfortunately, people are, have the demand of trying to get gifts and other stuff. So there's an uptick in burglaries. There's an uptick in breaking and entering. There's an uptick in retail shoplifting and larcenies. And so it's something that the retailers are hyper vigilant about, and it's just kind of an issue that we all have to deal with.
So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to lay out a scenario and kind of go through the different types of crimes that can happen in that scenario to give you all some insight into just how quickly these sorts of things can spiral. Some would say spiral out of control with just the amount of charges and how everything can stack up, because North Carolina courts are pretty clear on it that you can be charged with multiple crimes with this, that each kind of individual step of the whole operation or scheme or whatever can be individually charged, and it doesn't violate something called double jeopardy.
Right, and the way the statutes are written, there's different elements in these various different theft crimes that allow for them to be, a person to be charged with lots of them with one transaction.
Right, so in our scenario, we've got these two thieves who get together around the holiday time, and they come up with a plan, and their plan is to go to these different houses in a really nice neighborhood, but they want to know what they're up against. So they get one of them to dress up as a police officer and go door to door and talk to the people at the homes, look to see what kind of security systems that may have, whether or not they're going to be out of town, that sort of thing. So Harold, so far, what's going on there? So
as far as what they could be charged with just there, and a lot of people would think maybe nothing, but impersonating a police officer is certainly a crime in North Carolina, so that would be one. And two, they could just be charged with conspiracy because they're two people conspiring to commit a crime, and they've taken some sort of affirmative step in doing that. So both of those things could be charged.
So after they case the houses, they go, in the following days, they go to each house while the people are away. Maybe they're at work or they're on vacation, and they break into the homes and steal items from each one of these homes. So when that happens, what crimes could be charged?
So when they break into the home and they enter, it's breaking and entering could be charged, and then larceny after breaking and entering. And depending on what they take, they could also be charged with felony larceny. And so the difference between larceny after breaking and entering and felony larceny is that larceny after breaking and entering is just the taking, essentially, the elements of larceny, but it can be any item in that residence that's taken after a B&E, breaking and entering. And felony larceny can be any type of larceny where the value of the item is over $1,000.
And that's one of the ways that you can get to felony larceny. In fact, that's kind of a thing that I think some people get surprised about with larceny. A lot of people think if, let's say, you steal a car, they think that there's like a larceny of a motor vehicle. There's no larceny of a motor vehicle statute. It's felony larceny, and there's a good chance that as long as that car isn't some beat up piece of junk, that it's probably going to be valued at over $1,000.
Right.
And because it's valued at over $1,000, then all of a sudden you get to that felony larceny range. So a lot of times it comes down to the value or what the particular item is. So the fact that, let's say it's a firearm, larceny of a firearm is always a felony. So it just kind of depends. But so far these people have impersonated an officer. They've conspired to commit all these crimes. They've done a breaking and entering. Now, that type of breaking and entering, would that be a misdemeanor or would that be a felony? Because there's both, aren't there?
There is both, but this would be a felony breaking and entering because they are committing a felony after breaking and entering. So they're breaking and entering into a house with the plan to do something else and commit another crime, essentially. So there are two different kinds of breaking and entering. Misdemeanor breaking and entering would be just the breaking and entering without some other commission of some other crime afterward.
Mm-hmm. And so once they do this, there's one house in particular on the street that they're just like, this is their white whale that they want to knock over, but they can't go there during the day. They're thwarted every time that they try to go during the day. And so they decide to go at night and to try to break into the house to take jewelry and all the other nice things that are in the home. But they end up finding that somebody is there. There's an 11-year-old there, home alone. So what have they committed at that point?
At that point, it goes from, instead of being breaking and entering, it goes to burglary, and it would particularly be first-degree burglary because somebody is there. In North Carolina, if you do go and break and enter in somebody's house with the intent to commit some other crime, at night, it becomes a burglary, which has a different penalty. It's a higher crime, and if somebody is there, it's a first-degree burglary, which is a very serious crime. And so that's kind of how that's parsed out in North Carolina. And the at night thing isn't necessarily defined as a certain time in North Carolina, but it's just kind of considered after the sun sets. Is when nighttime is considered. So that could range, obviously, at different times depending on the time of year.
Right, which makes sense because 9 o'clock at night around Christmas is very dark, whereas 9 o'clock in the middle of summer, June, July, it might be a little bit dark. But it's not full on black and night. So that it definitely makes a difference. And then these guys, as they continued along, they left a calling card, didn't they? They left the water on in each house.
Yeah.
So what would happen? That's a crime too, isn't it?
I think so.
Yeah, that would be injury to real property,
Right.
I think. So obviously, y'all, we've been describing Harry and Marv from Home Alone. They've committed a litany of crimes. And, it's funny as you watch a lot of holiday movies. There's a lot of crimes that are committed in holiday and Christmas movies, and that was just one that was low-hanging fruit for what we were trying to talk about today. But a lot of people experience theft-related issues and charges with theft by being in a retail store. And that can vary. It can vary from a low-level shoplift all the way up to a misdemeanor larceny, and it can even go beyond that to felony larcenies, depending upon whether or not the value of the items in question were over $1,000, or whether or not there was a security device that was tampered with in trying to steal that item or take it away. But how do we get to these different levels, Harold?
So I think it's important for us to just really, North Carolina, we have, especially for retail, we have larceny and we have shoplifting. And, I think without knowing the details, you would think, they're probably about the same thing. But there's some important differences between them that we're going to talk about. So larceny has 7 elements, and they are taking personal property that's in the possession of another, and it's been carried away without consent and with the intent to deprive the possessor of it permanently while knowing that he or she is not entitled to it. Now, that's a mouthful. Essentially, it's stealing. All right, that's the easy way, but it's a lot to that.
It is, and it's in a way, it's a low threshold in some ways. Because, Harold, let's say that this was your Greenwood Law mug.
Right. And
I'm sitting here and I go, gosh, I like this mug, and I want to take it. I'm not going to offer you money for it or anything. And I grab the mug and I move it I've got it in my possession. It's no longer in your possession. And I've taken it and I put it down on the table. I moved from one table to the other because I've said, you know what? I don't want to take this from Harold. I want to actually, I've thought differently of it. In that instance, I've potentially just committed a larceny.
That's right.
Even though all I've done is move it 2 feet, 3 feet away. For that instance that I decided that I was going to dispossess you of the item permanently, make it my own, make an action to do so, then all of a sudden I've committed a larceny.
That's right. And the courts have determined that even just a small movement of an item with the intent to permanently deprive can be the larceny. And a lot of times what happens is, somebody's committing a crime, they're taking an air conditioning unit out of a window, and they just move it, and the officer sees them, and whoop whoop, they get caught right there moving it 2 inches. Well, even that small movement is enough to say, you had the intent to permanently deprive.
Right, and the classic case that gets talked about is somebody breaks into a home, and they grab an item, and they make it to the window, and they leave it there in the home, never left the home. But because it was moved from where it was supposed to be, right next to the window, then the larceny had occurred.
Right. Now, an important difference between larceny and shoplifting, especially for the holidays, is that larceny, there's an intent to permanently deprive. So that, the state has to prove that you had that intent. So a lot of times in the retail context, larceny isn't charged until a person leaves the last point of sale. And so, like if you're at Walmart and you sort of get past those those registers, and you get into that area right where you're about to go into the parking lot, a lot of times you'll get talked to by a loss prevention officer at that point. Now, shoplifting doesn't have that intent element. Shoplifting is simply, taking an item, concealing it on your person while you're in a retail store, while you're still in the store. So let's go through the elements. You conceal merchandise of a store without authority, without having purchased the merchandise while still on the premises. So think about the difference there. Essentially, shoplifting is if you take an item, this cup or this pen, and you conceal it, as you said, and you're still in the store, that's the crime, right? So it doesn't matter, and you didn't purchase it, that's the crime. So it doesn't matter if you intended to or not. It makes it a different sort of crime. And again, both of those, because they're different elements, they both can be charged separately, even though they're typically not charged separately.
If you're just joining us here on Greenwood Law, Dylan Greenwood, and we've got Harold Eustache with us here on For the Record, talking about theft-related crimes here in and around the holidays that we see in North Carolina, because we definitely see an uptick of that type of crime that occurs. And Harold, you've seen some pretty interesting examples of that in your time as a DA and as a defense attorney.
Yeah, when I would say larceny charges or larceny cases are in district court the cases that you have the most trials on outside of DWIs. And one in particular I can remember when I was on the DA side was a larceny at Walmart by an employee, which typically would be charged as a felony, but in this instance it was charged as a misdemeanor. The employee took a can of Pringles, went to the back, I believe opened it, and then decided against it for some reason, and then brought it back and put the can of Pringles back. That employee was fired and subsequently prosecuted for misdemeanor larceny. It kind of goes back to that example of just moving it and then putting it back. And now when you put something back, that doesn't discount the larceny that already happened. So that person was prosecuted, and the issue at trial was, just that. Did they have the intent to permanently deprive? They were eventually convicted of it, and of course, I think at that time, as far as sentencing, we tried to give them the most lenient sentence possible,
right,
considering it was a can of Pringles.
And there's some initial leniency because technically that could have been
right,
prosecuted and charged as a felony.
Right. And there's some other types of larcenies that are felonies too, aren't there? There
are. So, we've mentioned larceny of a gun. We've mentioned, larceny by something in excess of value of $1,000. Larceny, again, of a motor vehicle doesn't exist, but typically a motor vehicle is high enough in value that it gets over that threshold. Larceny by cutting or tampering with a security device is an automatic felony. Larceny by employee should technically be an automatic felony, but I think given the value in that case, maybe some consideration was taken. But in the elements for that crime in North Carolina, there's no value consideration. It's anything that's taken by the employee. And then you also have this really interesting larceny that's larceny by a trick, don't you, Harold?
Yes, you do. And that's, like we were saying earlier, that's like a bar question a lot of times, but it goes around deceit and so forth. An example of that would be a car lot gives a person permission to test drive a vehicle, and they take it. And you say, hey, I'm just taking this vehicle just to test drive it, but instead of that, you do something else. And so you sort of trick the person into consenting to give you the item, and instead of just doing what you agreed to do, you do something else and permanently deprive them of that. Another one is, so let me ask you this, Dylan. If somebody, let's say they go to Walmart again, we're using Walmart, and they pick something up off the shelf and they go to return it, and they get something of value for it, what is that? Well,
that is an interesting question, because then all of a sudden, in the process of taking the item, so the initial grabbing of the item, and let's say you put it under a coat or in a purse or whatever, that's a concealment. Separate crime. Typically, North Carolina follows the point of sale doctrine, even though that's not codified law or anything like that. We typically look at it, and once you get past that last point of sale, then all of a sudden you have shown enough intent to permanently deprive that all of a sudden it becomes a larceny. Separate crime. And so depending upon the value, if it was under $1,000, so let's say it's a couple of Blu-ray discs, you're probably going to be under that $1,000 threshold. And let's say you make it out. No one catches you. Okay, so you've already committed 2 crimes, a Class 3 concealment of goods, and then a Class 1 misdemeanor larceny. And you say, gosh, you know what? I don't know if I really need the DVDs. I could really use the cash. And you go back to Walmart, or you go back to Target or somewhere else, and you try to return the item for money. Then what you have done is committed a felony for obtaining property by false pretenses. Because if you're misrepresenting some fact about the past, present, or future, and so obviously you're misrepresenting a fact about the past because you're representing to the store that you actually legitimately bought the item. And then you're using that relationship that they're relying upon to then give you something of value, money, and you take that money, and you've obtained that property under such false pretenses that in North Carolina we've deemed that as a felony. And it doesn't matter whether the value of that is in excess of $1,000. It doesn't matter if it's a 50-cent piece of gum. If you've done it in that way, it's a felony. Wow. And so all of a sudden, that it becomes a much more serious issue. Unfortunately, during this time, though, Harold, we see some people who commit these crimes over and over again.
We do, and that can be charged as a habitual larceny. So if you've got 4 prior convictions, be they felony larcenies or any type of larceny, statute says, on that 5th time you're charged, you can be charged with habitual larceny, which is something that judges really look down upon, and prosecutors do too, and typically there is jail time involved with that type of charge, because at that point you would probably have been on probation multiple times previously, and that may not be seen as a way to as a adequate punishment. And a lot of times when somebody commits these larcenies over and over, they catch the attention of these employees of like Target and Walmart that are called loss prevention officers. And these are folks that are employees of Target and Walmart. They're generally in plain clothes. They generally are, they look like the regular shopper at Walmart and Target, and their job is to watch the cameras and walk around these stores and essentially catch people in shoplifting and larceny type situations. A lot of times what they do, they have sophisticated camera systems at these stores, and they can target people that look suspicious, prior to even them stealing something, but they can look at them and then they'll send somebody personally around that the person won't even notice that they're being watched, and they'll watch them all the way past the point of sale and then contact them right after the point of sale.
Oh yeah, if you've ever seen the sophistication of the system that they have, it looks like the Death Star.
It does.
I mean, they've got to have the ability to cover every inch of that store, and you think of how big a Walmart is, think of how big a Target is, how big a grocery store is, all of that. All of a sudden you got a sophisticated system to try to catch these individuals doing it, because from their perspective it's worth more to invest in a system like that and try to prosecute it than to lose the money out of the things that get stolen. And so we typically see a few loss prevention officers working together, one that's watching the cameras, cueing in on somebody that's exhibiting suspicious activity. And then oftentimes they'll send somebody that's plain clothes down on the floor, try to watch them and surveil them in the act to see if they can see it, not just on the camera, but them personally as well. So
they can testify to it later.
Right.
And I can tell you that these loss prevention officers, they testify as much as real officers. I mean, these guys are in court a lot, they testify a lot, so they understand what they need to prove or need to show in order to win these sorts of cases. And a lot of times even they have people that habitually commit larcenies, they have lists of people that are sort of banned from Walmart.
Oh yeah.
And they can, these cameras, they will see that person and they will, key in on a person that's been banned.
Yeah, because oftentimes if somebody's found guilty of a larceny, one of the conditions as a part of the judgment is that you're banned from that store. That's what a judge will levy in their final judgment on the case. And if you violate that, then all of a sudden that's a trespass if you come back on the property, in addition to a potential larceny. And it's not just a low-level trespass, it's the upper-level trespass. That's the Class 1 misdemeanor version of it. And then if you commit a larceny, then that's another Class 1 misdemeanor. And that's what we talk to people all the time. Class 1 misdemeanor is just 2 levels below being a felony. It's a serious charge. I mean, the maximum amount of time that you could face in jail is 120 days, and it happens.
Oh, I mean, I would say, of any charge that's a Class 1 that you would see people actually getting active time in custody for, larceny is it. Because a lot of times, if you've got a previous larceny or there's some other issue where, generally when you have that trespass plus the larceny, that means you have a previous one. Judges a lot of times are inclined to put that person in custody to kind of stop that behavior. And sometimes, there's another felony that just came to mind that is charged sometimes, and that's organized retail theft. And that's one where sometimes people go around to different Walmarts or Targets or different places, and they'll catch law enforcement, the ear of law enforcement by doing that, and they're charged with a specific felony for going around to different places and doing it in an organized way.
Well, and this isn't just larceny that can stack up. Concealment of goods can also stack.
Yeah.
If you get a second one within, I think it's 3 years, then all of a sudden it jumps from a Class 3 to a Class 2 misdemeanor and a required stint in jail. And then if you have 3 within a 5-year period, then all of a sudden that jumps to a Class 1 misdemeanor with a required stint of 11 days in jail. There are some ways to potentially get around that, but generally speaking, that's a requirement. So, again, these things can stack pretty quickly. But, larceny and shoplift and all that stuff, it's something that prosecutors do look at. They take serious. It doesn't matter if you try to go back and pay for the item typically. It can be a sign of good faith, when somebody like the two of us have to get involved and then all of a sudden we're trying to work something out for that individual on the case. And there are diversionary programs for those people. If you're a first-time offender of a larceny or a shoplift, then a lot of times, especially if the value of the item is able to be paid back, people are willing to work with you a little bit on it. It's not a guarantee, but typically speaking, that can happen to try to avoid some really harsh consequences, because a lot of people, and I think of one person in particular every time this time of the year, she got in a hard spot, had a car accident, had a lot of bad things happen at one time, and she just wanted to give her child a good Christmas.
Yep.
And she had a very weak moment and committed a larceny, and it was all Christmas-related type stuff. And it happens, and it's unfortunate when it does, but we're certainly there to help, but it is something that can definitely be taken care of.
Because this really is the type of charge where you do need counsel on this. If you're charged with a larceny or shoplift, it is in your best interest to have an attorney.
Yeah, if it shows up on your record, that's something that employers do not like to see.
Right.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this Sunday here on WTOB as we discuss all these issues surrounding theft and larceny here in North Carolina. And we'd ask you to join us next Sunday again here on WTOB for the Record with Greenwood Law, as we discuss another series about DWIs. And it's going to be a two-part series this time. And next Sunday, we're going to be discussing everything that leads up to a traffic stop with a law enforcement officer when someone's under suspicion of DWI. And then in the second part of the series, what are we going to be talking about, Harold?
We're talking about probable cause and how whether or not an officer has the ability to arrest somebody after DWI and all that stuff that happens there. But before we go, don't forget the Greenwood Law Bill of Rights. First, I will not represent myself in a court of law. 2, I will not do law enforcement's job for them. 3, I will not make statements when stopped by law enforcement. 4, I will not consent to searches when asked by law enforcement. And 5, I will not be my own star witness for the prosecution. Remember, everyone, that it's not a crime to know your rights and assert them. Stay informed, stay safe. This is For the Record with Greenwood Law, signing off.